Welcome to the third episode of Identity International's webinar series, Kashmir Beyond Conflict. This series will be running throughout the month of October, every Thursday and Saturday at 5 p.m. British Summer Time, where we will delve into the complexities of the Kashmiri identity with our esteemed guests. To receive notifications and updates regarding the series, please follow our social media platforms and/or register on our Eventbrite page by searching Kashmir Beyond Conflict. We apologize today for the late start. Nirja Matu was unable to join us due to unforeseen circumstances. Therefore, today we will be in conversation with our very own Neelam Iqbal. Neelam is a Pakistani Kashmiri student born in England. Her family's village in Pakistani Kashmir, Azad Jammu and Kashmir, is 2 hours away from the line of control between Pakistani-controlled Kashmir and India-controlled Kashmir. From a young age, her and her family have been involved in activism supporting the struggle for Kashmiri independence, specifically in solidarity with Kashmiris suffering in India. She has a Global Health BSc from Queen Mary University of London and has recently completed her master's at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in Control of Infectious Diseases. She is very passionate about conflict and health, infectious diseases, and disease control programs. Welcome, Neelam. So, let's start with the first question that we've been asking everybody as is. What does it personally mean to you to be Kashmiri?
I think that question is a bit of a misnomer for me. Growing up, I didn't really even know I was Kashmiri to some extent. Sort of being in England, we were always just like Pakistani, essentially, even when we sort of moved to Pakistan for about 2 years when I was younger. So that was, I think, when I started to realize that there was a difference, because we spent 1 year in Kashmir and I spent 2 years in Islamabad. And I realized the difference, like in Azad Kashmir, we'd have a sort of different national anthem that we'd sort of sing every morning. There was, that's when I started realizing these differences. When I went to school in Islamabad, there would be like these questions like, where are you from? Oh, like that's Kashmir. And there was a slight difference there. But even then, I think I was too young to like fully comprehend what those differences meant. But I think it wasn't until sort of my early teen years, like sort of 16, 17, 18, that I started really educating myself about the conflict and what was happening there. And a lot of this was sort of influenced from my family. Like my cousin became very active in the Kashmir solidarity movement that was happening in universities in London. She was educating me a lot about what was happening. And it was kind of a really weird moment where it was like, oh, like there's this whole like conflict going on there that like I never had any idea about, or never even knew that I had an association with at any point. And it was from then that I started learning more about slightly different from, sorry, did the connection go?
Just for a second, but it's okay now.
Yeah, and I think it was from sort of then on that I started feeling slightly different. So slightly different to just your average Pakistani or Indian person who I typically would just identify myself with. So for me growing up in England, I always just identified myself with anyone who was sort of South Asian in England, essentially, because the culture is very sort of the same and things like that.
Well, that's pretty interesting because, you're a member of the diaspora and the politics and everything, I guess, affected you from a sort of third party stance. And in that way, it must have been a lot more complicated because I know even as far as I've known you, it's whether or not you answer the question where you're from is, are you Pakistani or are you Kashmiri? And, it's like, where does your loyalty or sort of allegiance lie? And then on top of it, being British and then, having to account for how British you are or how Kashmiri you are or how Pakistani you are. It must be, the dynamics between all of that must be pretty difficult sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's also quite hard because I even felt like living in Azad Kashmir, there's just no sort of, I don't know, from my point of view and from my experience, there was no awareness or sort of perspective on what was going on across the line of control. Like there was this sense of sort of complacency that, we're just part of Pakistan essentially and everything is fine. And I found this more when I've sort of spoken to Kashmiris from the other side, from sort of the Indian controlled Kashmir. And their sense of identity is so strong. Like they're so like, yeah, we're Kashmiri, yeah, this is what that means, and this is our food, this is our clothes, this is everything. And I was like, for us, I don't know, it was just never like that. There's not this strong sense of identity that makes us Kashmiri, apart from like just the geographical, like, oh yeah, like we're from Kashmir, back home, like we're from Mirpur, we're from this village, and things like that. Which I think is really, it was really weird for me when I first started having those conversations with people from other parts of Kashmir, essentially.
The borders, do you think they make a difference? Like, as in, where's you being Pakistani Kashmir and then there's being an Indian Kashmir, as to whenever you've interacted with sort of, I guess you could call it the other side, does it like, do you see a difference between the culture or the way that they express themselves?
Yeah, so I think because the conflict is so apparent in the Indian side of Kashmir, like it's always there. It's like they grow up with this. They grow up with the protests. They grow up through lockdowns, crackdowns. It That conflict has become part of their identity, and I think that conflict also made them question their identity more. Like when you're younger and you see this stuff happening, you question, why is this happening? What's our history? Like, why is it that we're in this situation right now, and things like that. Whereas from the Pakistani side, it's invisible. It's like you don't really see it all the time. It's more insidious, sort of, things that are happening behind closed doors. And unless you're like super aware of it, it's like you don't really see what's happening. So I think it is very different in that sense, with the borders there.
I mean, the conversations that we've had so far, in the previous two series have been both with people that have been from India side Kashmir. If you, they've really highlighted on how they feel this otherness within India. Do you think there's a similar sort of feeling whilst you're in Pakistan, or the Pakistanis that you've come across and how they treat you as a Kashmiri, or back home whenever you visited, I know you were saying that you grew up in Islamabad and you didn't really feel at that young age, but now, like coming across other Pakistanis, even in England, or whenever you go back home for a visit, do you ever feel that sort of otherness that Indian Kashmir, the Indian side of Kashmir, like, do?
I think there's a slight otherness, but I don't, personally anyways, I don't think it's as apparent, or like the otherness isn't simply because of the conflict or the Pakistan-India situation with Kashmiris and Pakistanis. It will be other things like, oh, you're Kashmiri, so you're a bit more backward, or like you're mountain people. Like I've heard things like that, which were kind of weird for me. There's also been sort of situations where like I was seen as less of like a Pakistani because I was from Kashmir, which was also kind of odd. But these are sort of rare occasions. It wasn't something that I felt like I was dealing with all the time. But yeah, I think it is there, but I don't know how strong it is, basically. Like I don't feel like it impacted me too much.
Fair enough. Well, yeah. I mean, I guess that would be the fact that you're a member of a diaspora, but do you know any family members that might have experienced it more firsthand? Or what's it like as sort of a British, but I mean, you could say a British Kashmiri, and when you visit back home, the way that people back home treat you, is there a difference because you're from the diaspora? Do you feel a disconnect in your identity back home?
Yeah, like 100%. I think when you're sort of, with me, with my identity, it was always like British, Desi, Pakistani, and then Kashmiri kind of came later. And with my family back home, there's always been this disconnect. It's like, I go there and it's like, oh, you're from England, like you don't really understand, like you can't really speak our language, like you've just had a really privileged life, which obviously to some extent is true, and I understand why they feel that way. But in that same sense, it's like I could never fully relate to them either. But then at the same time, being here, it's like it's also harder because British people don't also understand so much. And I've had a lot of situations, as I said, learning more about sort of Kashmiri history and culture, where I'd have these conversations with Indians, and they would be so rude about the situation in Kashmir, and they would just say it so it was kind of like an offhanded comment, which was kind of worse because it was like there wasn't even any thought put into it. It was just as simple as like, yeah, like we don't really care for Kashmiris. Like they're just like bothering, like they're just creating trouble for no reason. And I just found it so interesting that someone could say that so easily about people, they're literally suffering in that part of the world. They've been oppressed for so many years. And you can just so offhandedly, after I tell you that I am Kashmiri as well, offhandedly just say to me like, yeah, like we don't really care about you guys. Like it's just you can do your own thing. And it's like, it was that those moments were really weird. And I found that a lot in England when I've spoken to Indians about the situation.
It's interesting considering how much it defines the relationship between India and Pakistan, as to how dismissive they are of the Kashmiri issue in the first place. It's like, if it doesn't matter that much, then why are you still battling over it, or making the people that live there, their lives practically hell with all the crackdowns and the lockdowns that we've heard about so far. But I mean, I guess it's that also that's probably motivated your research a lot of the time that you do, that on Kashmir and stuff. It's just that what could you talk about that a bit more as to how like your Kashmiri identity has influenced what you research and what you look into?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. So like as I was saying, it was during sort of those early teen years that I started discovering more about Kashmir in general. So when I did go to university and I started my BSc, I was sort of committed to doing something about Kashmir. So even for my thesis, I pushed and sort of found a supervisor who works on conflict and health. And I really wanted to find and analyze data on sort of health disparities in Azad Kashmir compared to Jammu and Kashmir. It was something I just thought would be really interesting because of how they are right next to each other, but it's just literally the government control, which could kind of show the political determinants of health in both of those regions. And my supervisor was so great. Like he traveled to Kashmir himself, like he knew so much about the situation, and he was really supportive. But it became so difficult. I had to end up sort of give up on the idea because finding reliable information on health statistics in either region was just not a thing. A lot of sources I would find, I'd later find evidence that said the Pakistanis mess with these to make it look worse, or like the Indian authorities mess with this to make it look better. And there was just a lot of controversy around a lot of the statistics I was finding. And it was really horrible, really, because other studies that had been done, so you can find other studies on mental health, especially in the Jammu and Kashmir region, and it just shows how much of a massive problem it is in there. Like there's multi-generational traumas getting passed through in Kashmir, and they're still living through it. The constant lockdowns, crackdowns. I even came across a study recently about students and how about like 90% of them suffer from trauma because of what they've seen just growing up. And so you've got like an extremely traumatized population there, and it's just there's not enough being done about it or being said about it. So that was something that I was really sort of passionate about in my research. Another thing I also researched with Kashmir was climate change and global health, which was a really interesting paper where I was looking at sort of the water insecurity in Kashmir. So a reason why Kashmir is also so important for that sort of India-Pakistan region is because of the Indus River basin. It starts from Kashmir before it flows down to India and Pakistan. So water source is a really important place in terms of water source. And that is something that's sort of politically underplayed as well, the importance of it as a natural resource. And I sort of looked into about how sort of with climate change, how there's going to be increasing water scarcity, how that's going to sort of exacerbate the conflict essentially, and it worsen the relations between Pakistan and India.
Just add another factor that basically the battle will be taking place over. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, how you mentioned trauma and mental health issues that were basically multi-generational, and have you had any experience that firsthand or even secondhand in your environment or surrounding around you? It's like affecting the people that you know or yourself in a way at all?
I mean, personally, I guess the only thing I could say is the most personal experience I've had is just conversations with my grandma, because she remembers to this day, sort of when I think it was sort of the 1989 when that sort of conflict broke out, and even before then, I guess from partition as well. She always, it's something that she'll always bring up when we sort of talk, and like she's kind of in her old age now, so she's always sort of recollecting her younger memories. She always brings up about like how, you know, back in the day in Kashmir, like it was just so nice. Like you'd have Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Sikhs, like would all be living side by side. You know, I think she always recalls, she was like, there was this Christian guy who'd always wake up at like Fajr time and, you know, do the azan and like wake up the whole sort of village for azan. And that was the kind of like really, like people just lived really nicely together. And then she says like, and then she's like, and then I just remember this day where I was in my village and there were just bodies everywhere. She literally, and I was in the village with her once, and she was literally like telling me like, yeah, this whole valley was just full of bodies and blood, and it's just never been the same since then. And I think that's the closest sort of personal experience I've had to that trauma, because like I said before, I am quite lucky and quite privileged with how removed I am from the situation in Azad Kashmir, and also just, you know, from what's going on in Jammu and Kashmir in general. But yeah, that's the sort of closest experience I've had with that, I'd say.
And within the diaspora, have you noticed a difference between Kashmiris and the way that they've sort of, I guess, quote unquote, assimilated into like British society, whereas other members or other, you know, other members of diaspora, where the Pakistani or from other past aspects of, you know, other places in South Asia or even non-South Asians, is there a difference that you witnessed between Kashmiri diaspora and the remaining lot, like with your encounters?
I know that like in general, I found, especially in England, like there are a lot of the Pakistani side anyway, diaspora that's in Britain are from Kashmir, essentially, are from Azad Kashmir. And so in my example as well, it was sort of my granddad who fought in the war and sort of got injured. And so that he was sort of brought into England because of that, because he fought on behalf of England. So a lot of them are kind of have been in England for longer. And they tend to be more sort of working class as well. So it's like you'd get a lot of the taxi drivers, a lot of the shop owners and things like that. But I wouldn't be able to talk too much about, because I genuinely, apart from my family and a few other people, I don't know too many Azad Kashmiris in Britain.
But just your encounters with, like, say, Pakistanis and the way that they've assimilated. Obviously, this is a very generalized sort of, you know, it's a question, but is there a disparity between the way Kashmiris have assimilated and other Pakistanis may have assimilated within, like, British society?
I personally don't think so. And that's why me growing up for the longest time, I literally just thought I was Pakistani. Like, you know, that's how sort of even we were brought up. Like we never even spoke about being different or being Kashmiri. It was just like, yeah, we're Pakistani, we're from Pakistan. So with me, personally, it was a weird realization growing up that I wasn't Pakistani. So I couldn't say that I felt any different or it was any different, because I always thought I was the same. Even Indians that were around me, I just thought like we were all the same, essentially.
And now,
growing up.
pardon?
I said it was probably part of my own sort of ignorance growing up, and just being in the diaspora. It's anyone who's sort of from similar regions to you, you kind of just identify with.
I guess it also makes sense in the way that when you're checking boxes on a form, there's either Indian British or Pakistani British, but there's never Kashmiri British, right? Or there's other, or prefer not to say, because you only have those limited boxes, because that's what you have to kind of box yourself into, and that's what you grow up thinking, because it starts from a very young age, you know.
100%. It's like we're all associated with curry.
Yeah.
And cricket, and so we're all just that same bracket, essentially.
Blanket Asians, that's it. Like it's either you're white or you're the other in a way.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
How has that affected you though? Just, I mean, I guess it doesn't really. There's probably whatever like this probably applies to all South Asians across the blank, across the board, but just as I guess an Asian British, how does that affected your identity growing up? Sort of encountering, I guess, other members of society or growing up in an area that wasn't very multicultural either, right? How do you think that has molded your identity on a personal level?
I think for me it was difficult in the sense that I think a lot of other people could also agree when they've traveled from their home countries and then they come to England at a young age. Because I think I felt it a lot when we came back from Pakistan. So after having lived there for like 3 years, I think from the ages of like 6 to 9. So it's kind of like you become a lot of yourself in those ages. And I got so used to just like never having to like, never being treated differently because of my skin color, never having certain looks because I, eat different foods or, things like that. And then when I came back, I struggled a lot with high school, especially sort of the first few years of secondary school. I found it really hard. I found it so hard to relate to any of like the people in my school, any of like the other children, because there was just such a disconnect in like the culture and what I was used to, and how I was used to like. With me personally, what I felt was that people, when I came back, the kids in Britain were just a lot more like harder to talk to. Like it was just so hard. Like you had to be like them or they weren't interested. And just I think that, but if anything, that kind of made me stronger in my sort of Asian identity, if anything. And I think that if I hadn't had that experience growing up, I would have been a lot more different now. But because I always had those memories to look back on, and I was like, that's where I felt a belonging. Like always throughout my childhood, I always look back and I'm like, when I was in Pakistan, I felt like I belonged. Like there was never this question that I'm not somewhere, like where you have that feeling. I think a lot of like people of color can probably relate to that, where you're in, school or something like that. Everyone just looks at you and, you always have to justify things about yourself. And yeah, I think it kind of pushed me more towards my Asian side a lot more, I think.
Has that worked against you in any way though, growing up here, maybe even career-wise or working life-wise or educational-wise? Do you think that there has been some sort of hindrances in what you can achieve here?
I feel I guess I'm quite lucky with the sort of field that I decided to study in and things like that. It's very inclusive. The fact that I could even study about, had the opportunity to look into Kashmir, to look into like Yemen and things like that, and that there was a lot of diversity and things like that. I think, I don't know if it's a bad thing though, but like the fact that I've sort of built such a strong sense of who I am, especially from an Asian perspective. And I think when you're in countries like England and America, you also have to be kind of brave and fierce about that identity as well, because there's a lot of subliminal sort of, xenophobic attacks that you'll get, that many of us get, that we just let slide because it's like, I think it's being a woman as well. Being a woman and then also being a person of color, you let things slide because it's like, oh, like, they're more powerful, like, we can't speak out of tongue or we can't say too much. We don't want to offend other people. And I think that's been something that I have struggled with in sort of workplaces and sort of in sort of later education, that there's certain moments where you'll get a lot of ignorance from people and trying to navigate through that without being too emotional. And, trying to navigate through that in a way that helps them understand rather than pushing them further away from what you're trying to say. That's the main way I've probably struggled in terms of trying, interacting with those situations.
Do you think it's growing up, as in, would there be a self-inflicted, maybe psychological barrier between what you could have probably done in this society, or like Just because I know personally, at least growing up here and still being part of the diaspora as well, you kind of get this idea fit into your head because either you're a woman or you're from an Asian descent, or even though the fact that you wear a headscarf, you know, it can stop you from doing certain things. So it makes you less inclined to go for opportunities that are bigger or, you know, considered to be sort of up there. Do you think that's a similar thing that you've probably gone through, or
I can see why a lot of people do, but I think with me, and I think this also comes down to sort of role models that you have around you. And with me, like, I'm just really lucky. Like, my mom has always been someone who goes for anything that she wants to. Like, she will always jump into every opportunity, and she's always taught me that never let anything stop you from sort of achieving what you want. And that kind of mindset has really been sort of instilled in me to sort of an annoying extent, I guess, where I'm just like, yeah, let's do it, like, no matter what, like, anything is worth a try. I do think being sort of a woman, being, you know, Asian, being a hijabi even, it makes it harder for sure. And it's like you have to work double, triple time to get to that same place that someone else with more privilege probably wouldn't have had to put in that much effort. But it's just, what else are you supposed to do, right? It's like, it's just harder. I do think that people like us, we just have to try harder, and it can be exhausting. But what is the alternative to just not do anything?
fair enough. That's quite inspiring. um, all right. I mean, I guess if there's anything else that you would like to add about, you know, being either Kashmiri, being a Kashmiri, or, you know, a member of the diaspora, or any sort of final remarks that you would like to might make.
Nah, I guess it's just, I think it's, what's really sad with this whole sort of Kashmiri situation is that, just from my personal experience as well, that the people on Azad Kashmiri side don't talk about it enough. We're not loud enough about it. We don't seem to really care about the situation in Jammu and Kashmir enough. And obviously, to some extent, that's because we're so removed from it. But I also think that that gives us, that's more insidious, essentially, and that should be more reason for us to be speaking out. Azad Kashmir in general, like, we have a lot of diaspora sort of scattered across the world, and I think, you know, together, if we were sort of more aware of this, if we were spreading the word more, if we were actually being more involved and passionate about this issue, it would make more of a difference as well.
Well, I hope it does motivate people because, I mean, Kashmiri or not, what's happening and the people that are, you know, suffering because of it, people should be speaking about it. And the less we let that, like, the more we let that die out, the less the conflict will get the limelight and it will get overlooked, and more people will just end up dying, and oppression will continue within the region. So it's definitely something that people need to become more vocal about and active towards. But yeah, so that was a very insightful conversation from a, you know, a Kashmiri woman growing up within Britain and you know, maneuvering within that society. I would like to thank you so much for joining us and giving us your incredible insight. And thank you to our audience for watching. Our next episode will be on Saturday at the same time, where we will hopefully be in conversation with Bill Koul, who is an author, a writer, and a philosopher, plus an up and running candidate for, I think it was Perth politics in Australia. And we shall see you then. Thank you again from Identity International.
Thank you.